This isn't supposed to happen. Not like this. Right now, there's an island where 170,000 people are running out of options. Not because they waited too long, because there is nowhere left to go. Flights are limited. Time is running out, and the storm approaching them is still getting stronger. But that's not the part that should worry you. Because while all of this is happening, the rest of the system is starting to break pattern. Across the United States, multiple extreme events are unfolding at the same time. Tornado outbreaks, flash flooding, blizzard conditions, fire weather risks, all within the same window. And this isn't random. It's the third time this has happened in just 11 days. So the real question isn't how strong this storm will get. The real question is, what happens when everything starts happening at once? Stay with this, because once you see how all of this connects, you won't look at these events the same way again. If you find this useful, hit like, subscribe for more breakdowns like this, and tell me what you think about this in the comments. Something unusual is happening right now, and if you're not paying attention, you might already be behind. At this exact moment, across different parts of the world, multiple extreme events are unfolding. Not one, not two, several. In one region, the sky is feeding massive storms. In another, entire landscapes are being buried under snow. Elsewhere, water is rising fast enough to swallow roads, homes, entire neighborhoods. And in one isolated location, a storm is forming that could change everything for the people trapped there. On their own, each of these events would be serious. But that's not what makes this dangerous. What makes this different is that all of it is happening at the same time. This isn't just bad weather. This is something else. This is what experts call a compounding disaster. It means multiple threats are developing simultaneously, and instead of staying separate, they begin to interact, overlap, and amplify each other. And when that happens, the system that's supposed to handle emergencies starts to stretch. Then it starts to strain, and eventually, it can start to fail. To understand how this begins, you have to focus on one place. A small island in the Pacific Ocean, Guam. At first glance, Guam doesn't seem like the center of anything major. It's remote. It's isolated. It's surrounded by thousands of miles of open ocean. But right now, that isolation is exactly what makes it vulnerable. Because moving slowly across the Pacific, gathering strength, is a storm. Typhoon Sinlaku. Right now, it doesn't look catastrophic. Not yet. But the models are showing something that's raising concern among meteorologists. This storm is not moving quickly, and that's a problem, because slow-moving systems have time. Time to organize, time to intensify, time to become far more dangerous than they initially appear. And the longer Sinlaku stays over warm ocean water, the more energy it absorbs. That energy doesn't just disappear, it builds. Wind speeds increase, pressure drops, the structure becomes more stable, more defined, more powerful. Forecast projections are already indicating that this system may not stay weak for long. It has the potential to strengthen into a Category 3, possibly even a Category 4 typhoon. And if that happens, the situation changes completely. A Category 4 storm is not just strong. It's destructive. Sustained winds can exceed 130 miles per hour. That's strong enough to tear roofs off buildings, to knock out power grids across entire regions, to shut down communication systems, to leave areas isolated for days or longer. Now imagine facing something like that on a large mainland. You'd have options: highways, evacuation routes, nearby cities. Now remove all of that. That's Guam. There are no long-distance highways leading out. There's no neighboring state you can drive to. Evacuation depends almost entirely on flights and limited maritime options. And when a serious storm approaches, those options begin to disappear quickly. Flights get canceled, ports shut down, and suddenly, the window to leave closes. Not slowly, abruptly. Now think about what that means for the people living there. You know the storm is coming. You can see the forecasts. You understand the risk. But you can't leave, because there's nowhere to go. This is where the situation shifts from dangerous to critical. Because once evacuation is no longer possible, everything depends on preparation. Shelters, infrastructure, emergency response. And under normal circumstances, those systems are designed to handle a major storm. But these are not normal circumstances. Because while Guam is preparing for a potentially devastating typhoon, something else is happening. In other parts of the world, and especially across the United States, multiple extreme weather events are developing at the same time. Individually, they would each demand attention. Together, they start to compete for it. And that's where the real problem begins. Because disasters don't just test nature, they test systems. Emergency management, logistics, resources, attention, and when too many demands hit at once, even strong systems can start to break down. What's unfolding right now isn't just a storm heading toward an island. It's a setup, a situation where multiple risks are aligning at the same time. And when those risks begin to overlap, the outcome becomes far less predictable. Because the real danger isn't just what's happening in one place. It's what's happening everywhere, all at once. And this is only the beginning. If this were just about one storm, the situation would be serious. But manageable. That's how modern emergency systems are designed. One major event happens, resources are mobilized, attention is focused, response is coordinated. But that only works when events stay isolated. Right now, they're not. While Typhoon Sinlaku continues to organize in the Pacific, a completely different pattern is unfolding across the United States. And at first, it doesn't seem connected. Different locations, different types of weather, different impacts. But when you step back and look at the bigger picture, a pattern starts to emerge. Multiple hazard zones are activating at the same time. Across the Central Plains, atmospheric conditions are becoming unstable. Warm, moist air from the Gulf is pushing northward, colliding with cooler, drier air descending from the Rockies. That contrast creates energy. And when that energy builds to a certain point, it doesn't just sit there. It releases, violently. Tornado outbreaks begin to develop. Not isolated tornadoes. Clusters, storm systems capable of producing multiple tornadoes in a short period of time. These aren't events you prepare for days in advance with perfect precision. They evolve quickly, they shift, and they can strike with very little warning. Emergency services in those regions are already on alert, monitoring conditions that could escalate within hours. Now shift west, the Sierra Nevada. Instead of instability, you have accumulation. Cold air locking into place, moisture feeding into the system, snowfall rates increasing. A major blizzard is forming. Visibility drops. Roads close. Transport slows to a near stop. Entire regions can become cut off, not because of wind or water, but because of snow. At the same time, further south and west, the pattern flips again. Dry conditions, strong winds, low humidity. This combination creates what's known as critical fire weather. In these environments, it doesn't take much. A spark, a down power line, even friction. And once a fire starts under these conditions, it doesn't spread slowly. It moves fast, faster than response teams can always contain. Now shift again. Kansas. Heavy rainfall is building over already saturated ground. When the soil can't absorb any more water, runoff begins immediately. Flash flooding becomes a real threat. And flash floods are deceptive. They don't build gradually like river floods. They rise quickly. Minutes, not hours. One moment the road is clear. The next, it's underwater. Now move even further out. Hawaii. Different location, same problem. Intense rainfall, rapid accumulation, terrain that channels water into narrow paths. Flash flooding again. Localized, but severe. And all of this is happening at the same time. Different states, different conditions, different hazards, but overlapping in time. If you were to map it out, you wouldn't see one crisis. You would see multiple zones lighting up simultaneously. And each of those zones requires attention, personnel, equipment, logistical coordination, communication. Under normal circumstances, that's possible. But as the number of active events increases, something begins to happen. Resources start to divide. Emergency teams that would normally be concentrated in one area are now spread across multiple regions. Equipment is allocated, reassigned, stretched. Decision makers are forced to prioritize. And prioritization always comes with a cost, because focusing on one area often means giving less attention to another. This is where the concept of a compounding disaster becomes real. It's not just that multiple events are happening, it's that they are competing for the same resources, the same attention, the same response capacity. Now bring this back to Guam, a small island facing a potentially major typhoon. Under ideal conditions, that situation alone would justify full national attention. Preparation efforts, resource positioning, emergency coordination at the highest levels. But right now, attention isn't concentrated. It's fragmented, pulled in multiple directions at once. And that changes how effectively any single location can be supported. Because response systems are not infinite. They have limits. And when those limits are approached, the margin for error shrinks. What might have been manageable under normal conditions becomes more difficult. What might have been well supported becomes under-supported. And what might have been contained becomes harder to control. At this point, you're not just dealing with weather. You're dealing with capacity. How much strain the system can handle before performance starts to degrade. And the more simultaneous events there are, the more that strain increases. The situation is no longer about a single storm approaching an island. It's about a network of events, all unfolding at once, all drawing from the same pool of resources. And when that pool is stretched thin enough, the effects start to show. Not immediately, but gradually. Response times increase. Coverage gaps appear. Decisions become more difficult. And in some cases, some areas inevitably receive less support than they need. This is where the risk begins to shift, from natural events to systemic pressure. Because once systems are under pressure, the outcome of each individual event becomes less predictable. And when predictability drops, risk increases. Right now, that pressure is building. And the question is no longer just what each storm will do. It's what happens when all of them unfold at the same time. Because that's when the situation moves beyond weather, into something much harder to manage. Up to this point, everything might still feel manageable. Different disasters, different regions, different responses. But here's where the situation starts to shift. Because what looks like separate events isn't actually separate. There's a deeper connection, not at the surface level, where you see storms, snow, or fire, but in the underlying structure of the atmosphere itself. To understand what's really happening, you have to zoom out. Way out. High above the surface, the atmosphere isn't random. It moves in patterns. Large-scale flows of energy that guide where storms form, how they move, and how they evolve. One of the most important of these patterns is something called a Rossby wave. You don't need to remember the name, just understand the behavior. Instead of air moving in straight lines, it begins to bend, to curve, to form massive waves that stretch across continents. These waves create regions of rising air and sinking air, and those regions control everything below, where storms intensify, where dry conditions take over, where temperatures spike or drop. Now here's the key point. When these waves become amplified, everything becomes more extreme. Storm systems grow stronger. Dry zones become drier. Cold regions get colder. And instead of moving quickly, these patterns can slow down. They can stall, which means the same conditions stay locked in place for longer periods of time. That's exactly what's happening right now. The atmosphere isn't just active, it's amplified. And when you combine that with another factor, something known as an ENSO transition, you get even more instability. Again, you don't need the technical details, just the effect. Energy is being redistributed across the planet. Ocean temperatures shift, wind patterns adjust, and the atmosphere responds. Sometimes in ways that are predictable, sometimes in ways that aren't. Right now, those changes are aligning in a way that allows multiple extreme events to develop at once. Not because of coincidence, but because the system itself is favoring it. This is why you're seeing tornado conditions in one region, while another deals with snow and another with fire. It's all being shaped by the same large-scale pattern. Different outcomes, same underlying driver. Now bring this back to Typhoon Sinlaku. Tropical systems don't just form randomly. They depend on environmental conditions, sea surface temperatures, wind shear, atmospheric stability. And right now, those conditions are becoming more favorable for intensification. Warm water is acting like fuel. Low wind shear allows the storm structure to remain intact. And the broader atmospheric pattern is not disrupting it. It's supporting it. That's why the slow movement becomes even more concerning. Because nothing is pushing the system away or breaking it apart. It's being allowed to organize, to strengthen, to evolve into something more powerful. At the same time, those same atmospheric patterns are helping sustain extreme conditions elsewhere. The plains remain unstable. The Sierra Nevada continues to receive heavy snowfall. The Southwest stays dry and vulnerable to fire. The system is locked into a configuration that supports multiple hazards simultaneously. And when a pattern like this locks in, it doesn't change quickly. It persists, which means these events don't just happen. They continue. They overlap. They build on top of each other. Now think about what that means from a response perspective. If events were short-lived, resources could shift. One area stabilizes, support moves to another. But when everything is ongoing at the same time, that flexibility disappears. You can't easily reallocate resources when every region still needs them. You can't scale down one response to reinforce another. Everything remains active. Everything demands attention. This is where the pressure begins to compound. Not just because of the number of events, but because of their duration. And duration changes everything. A short event can be intense, but manageable. A prolonged event, even if slightly less intense, can be more damaging overall, because it exhausts systems, personnel, supplies, coordination. And when exhaustion sets in, performance drops. Mistakes become more likely. Gaps begin to form. Now layer in another factor: uncertainty. Even with advanced forecasting, there are limits. Storm tracks shift. Intensity forecasts change. Timing adjustments happen. And when you have multiple systems evolving at once, those uncertainties multiply. One small change in one system can affect how resources are allocated, which then affects response in another region. Everything becomes interconnected, not directly, but through the systems managing them. At this stage, the situation is no longer just about predicting weather. It's about managing complexity. And complexity is harder to control because it introduces variables that don't behave in simple, linear ways. One event doesn't just add to the total risk. It changes how other events are handled. And that's where the real challenge begins. Because when multiple extreme events are driven by the same large-scale pattern, and that pattern remains stable, You don't just get one crisis. You get a sustained period of overlapping crises. And that's when systems are pushed toward their limits. Not instantly, but progressively. And once those limits are approached, the margin for error becomes very small, which means even minor disruptions can have much larger consequences. And that's where the next layer of risk starts to emerge. At this point, the situation is already under pressure. Multiple disasters, sustained conditions, limited flexibility. But there's another layer most people don't think about, and it doesn't come from the ground or the ocean or even the atmosphere. It comes from above, space. Because while all of this is unfolding on Earth, there are also changes happening in near-Earth space that can directly affect how we respond to emergencies. This is where things start to get more complicated, not more dramatic, more fragile. High above the planet, satellites orbit constantly. Communication satellites, weather satellites, navigation systems. They are part of the invisible infrastructure that modern emergency response depends on. When a storm forms, satellites track it. When evacuation orders are issued, communication networks deliver them. When response teams coordinate, they rely on positioning systems and data links that depend on space-based technology. Most of the time, this system works seamlessly. You don't notice it, because it doesn't fail. But under certain conditions, it can degrade. And one of those conditions is something called elevated electron flux. In simple terms, increased activity in space can send higher levels of charged particles into Earth's near-space environment. These particles interact with satellites. They don't usually destroy them, but they can interfere. Sensors become less reliable. Signals degrade. Data transmission can become unstable. It's not a complete blackout. It's something more subtle, a reduction in performance. Now imagine that happening during a period when you already have multiple disasters on the ground. You're relying heavily on accurate data, on clear communication, on real-time updates. And suddenly, the systems providing that information are slightly less reliable. Not enough to stop everything, but enough to introduce friction, delays, uncertainty. Now think about how emergency decisions are made. They depend on timing, precision, confidence in the data. If a storm track shifts slightly, that changes evacuation zones. If communication lags, that delays coordination. If positioning data becomes less accurate, that affects logistics. Individually, these might seem like small issues. But in a high-pressure environment, small issues don't stay small. They stack, they compound, and when they do, they begin to affect outcomes. This is what makes this layer important. It's not about catastrophic failure. It's about reduced reliability. And reduced reliability during a crisis is dangerous because it increases uncertainty at the exact moment when clarity is most needed. Now combine this with everything already happening. Multiple extreme weather events, sustained atmospheric patterns, resources stretched across regions, and now, a subtle degradation in the systems that support response efforts. You don't need a complete breakdown for problems to emerge. You just need enough friction, enough delay, enough uncertainty, and the entire system becomes harder to manage. This is where the concept of compounding risk becomes very real. It's not just about adding more problems. It's about how those problems interact. A storm alone is manageable. Multiple storms are more difficult. But multiple storms, combined with strained resources, prolonged conditions, and reduced system reliability, that's where complexity increases sharply. And complexity is where things become unpredictable. Because in complex systems, outcomes don't scale linearly. A small issue in one area can trigger larger effects elsewhere. A delay in communication can slow response. A slowed response can increase damage. Increased damage requires more resources, but those resources are already limited. and the cycle continues. At this stage, the situation is no longer stable. It's sensitive to changes, sensitive to disruptions, sensitive to anything that adds pressure. And the more sensitive a system becomes, the harder it is to control. This doesn't mean failure is guaranteed, but it does mean the margin for handling unexpected events becomes very narrow. And when margins are narrow, resilience decreases. Now consider Guam again, a single location, facing a potentially severe typhoon, depending on external support systems, at a time when those systems are already under strain and possibly operating with reduced efficiency. This is where isolation becomes a serious disadvantage, because support isn't just about availability. It's about timing, how quickly resources can be deployed, how effectively communication flows, how accurately conditions are monitored. If any of those factors are compromised, even slightly, the impact on isolated regions becomes more significant. This is not about panic. It's about understanding how multiple layers of risk can align, each one manageable on its own, but together, creating a situation that is much harder to navigate. And right now, those layers are aligning. Not perfectly, but enough to matter, which raises a critical question. If this is how systems behave under current conditions, what happens if the pressure increases even further? Because so far, everything you've seen is based on what is already happening, but the situation is still evolving, and the next phase depends on how these systems continue to interact. Over time, so far, you've seen how multiple systems are aligning. Weather patterns, resource allocation, infrastructure dependence, even subtle disruptions from space. Each layer adds pressure, but pressure alone doesn't define the outcome. What defines the outcome is how systems respond under that pressure. And that's where timing becomes critical. Because in any emergency situation, response isn't just about what you do. It's about when you do it. A delayed decision, even by minutes, can change the scale of impact. A delayed evacuation order can put more people at risk. A delayed deployment of resources can slow containment. A delayed warning can reduce the time people have to react. Under normal conditions, response systems are built to minimize those delays. There are protocols, chains of command, predefined plans, but those systems assume something very important. They assume focus. One primary event, one central threat. Right now, that assumption doesn't hold, because attention is divided. Decision makers are not looking at a single map. They're looking at multiple maps, multiple timelines, multiple risk assessments, and each one demands urgency. Now imagine having to decide where to send limited resources. Do you prioritize the tornado outbreaks developing in the plains? Do you focus on the blizzard impacting transportation and supply routes in the Sierra Nevada? Do you allocate more to regions facing fire weather conditions? Or do you shift attention toward Guam, where a potentially major typhoon is approaching? There is no perfect answer. Every decision has a trade-off, and trade-offs mean compromise, which means some areas will receive less than ideal support, not because they're unimportant, but because resources are finite. This is where prioritization becomes a risk factor. Because prioritization is based on projections, and projections are not always exact. Storms can intensify faster than expected. Paths can shift. Conditions can escalate. If a system underestimates one threat while focusing on another, the imbalance can grow quickly. Now consider the timeline of Typhoon Sinlaku. It's slow-moving, which might seem like it gives more time, but in reality, it creates uncertainty. A fast-moving storm arrives quickly, but its path is often more predictable in the short term. A slow-moving storm has more time to change, to adjust its track, to strengthen unexpectedly. And that makes planning more difficult, because you're not just preparing for what is known, you're preparing for what might change. At the same time, the longer a storm remains active, the longer it occupies attention, which means resources stay committed for longer periods. Now connect that with everything else. Other regions are also demanding sustained response. The tornado threat doesn't resolve instantly. The blizzard doesn't clear overnight. Fire conditions can persist for days. Flood risks remain as long as rainfall continues. Nothing is resolving quickly. Everything is ongoing. And that's where fatigue begins to enter the system. Not just physical fatigue, operational fatigue, decision fatigue. When teams are managing multiple high-risk situations over extended periods, the cognitive load increases. More information to process, more variables to track, more decisions to make. And as that load increases, efficiency can decrease. Not because of incompetence, but because of limits. Every system has them. Now think about how that affects coordination. Emergency response isn't a single action. It's a network of actions. Local agencies, state-level coordination, federal support, all working together. When everything is functioning well, that network is strong. But as pressure increases, coordination becomes more complex. Communication lines become busier. Data flows become heavier. And even small misalignments can create delays. A message not received in time. A resource not deployed where it's needed most. A misinterpretation of evolving conditions. Again, individually, these are small issues. But in a high-pressure environment, they don't stay isolated. They interact. They compound. Now return to Guam, a location that depends heavily on external coordination. Supplies need to be delivered. Support needs to be organized. Information needs to flow clearly and consistently. But that coordination is happening within a system that is already managing multiple demands. Which means Guam is not just facing a storm. It's relying on a system that is already under strain. And that changes the level of risk. Because even if the storm behaves as expected, even if preparations are strong, the effectiveness of the response depends on everything else working smoothly. And right now, smooth operation is harder to maintain. This is where the situation becomes less about the intensity of individual events and more about the interaction between them. How one event influences the response to another. How delays in one area affect outcomes in another. How limited resources shape decisions across multiple regions. At this stage, the system is not failing, but it is being tested continuously. And the longer this continues, the more that test intensifies, which brings the focus back to one key factor: time. Because the longer these conditions persist, the more opportunities there are for something to go wrong. Not because of a single catastrophic failure, but because of accumulated strain. Small issues building over time, until they begin to have larger effects. And that's when the situation can shift from controlled to difficult to manage. Up to this point, everything you've seen has been building pressure. Multiple events, sustained conditions, divided resources, operational strain. But now the focus shifts to something more subtle. Not what is happening, but how close the system is to its limits. Because every system, no matter how strong, has a threshold, a point where performance begins to change. Not instantly, not in a dramatic collapse, but gradually. Efficiency drops, response slows, flexibility decreases. And the problem is, you don't always see that threshold clearly. You only recognize it once you're close to it. Right now, the system managing these events is still functioning, but it's operating under increasing load. And load changes behavior. Think about how emergency response normally works. There's a buffer, extra capacity built into the system to handle unexpected situations. Reserve personnel, backup equipment, redundant communication paths. These buffers are what create resilience. They allow the system to absorb shocks without breaking. But buffers are not infinite. As more events occur simultaneously, those reserves begin to get used. Not all at once, but steadily. A team deployed here, equipment redirected there, attention divided across regions. And with each allocation, the buffer shrinks. Now imagine what happens when that buffer becomes very small. The system is still operational, but it has less room to adapt, less ability to respond to new problems, less tolerance for unexpected changes. This is where things become fragile, not weak. Fragile, because fragility doesn't mean something is already broken. It means it can break more easily under additional stress. Now consider how new problems can appear. A sudden shift in a storm's path, an unexpected intensification, a localized infrastructure failure. Under normal conditions, these would be manageable, but in a system already near its limits, even small changes can have amplified effects. A delayed response here, a misallocation there, and suddenly, the situation becomes more complex than anticipated. This is where cascading effects can begin. One issue leads to another. A delay in response increases damage. Increased damage requires more resources. Those resources are already limited, so something else receives less support, and that imbalance creates new vulnerabilities. It's not a chain reaction that happens instantly. It's a progression, one step influencing the next. Now layer in human factors, because systems are not just technology. They're people, decision makers, first responders, operators, all working under pressure. And as pressure increases, so does fatigue. Not just physical fatigue, cognitive fatigue, the strain of processing large amounts of information, making rapid decisions, maintaining situational awareness across multiple evolving events. Over time, that strain affects performance. Reaction times slow slightly. Judgment becomes more difficult. The margin for error narrows. And again, these are not dramatic failures. They are small degradations. But in a high-risk environment, small degradations matter because they accumulate. Now return to the idea of simultaneous disasters. Each one is evolving. Each one is demanding attention. Each one is changing over time. And all of them are interacting with the same limited system. At this stage, the question is no longer whether the system can handle one event. It can. The question is whether it can maintain performance across all of them at once, over an extended period. Because duration is now the critical factor. The longer this situation persists, the more pressure builds. The more buffers are used. The more fatigue sets in. The more opportunities there are for small issues to emerge. And when those issues begin to overlap, they can create larger effects. This is what separates a challenging situation from a critical one. Not just intensity, but persistence under strain. Now bring this back to Typhoon Sinlaku. The storm is still evolving, still strengthening, still approaching a region with limited evacuation options. At the same time, the broader system that would support response efforts is already engaged elsewhere, already under load, already using its buffers. This doesn't guarantee failure, but it changes the risk profile, because the outcome is no longer determined by a single variable. It's determined by how multiple variables interact: weather behavior, resource availability, system capacity, human performance, all moving at once, all influencing each other. And when multiple variables are in motion, predictability decreases. You can model scenarios. You can estimate outcomes, but you can't account for every interaction, which means uncertainty increases. And uncertainty is one of the most difficult factors to manage in any emergency, because it affects decision-making, planning, execution. Everything depends on having reliable expectations. And when those expectations become less certain, strategies become more cautious, or in some cases, more reactive. neither is ideal, because proactive response requires confidence, and reactive response often means you're already behind. At this stage, the system is not collapsing, but it is approaching a state where control becomes more difficult to maintain, where outcomes depend more on how variables align, and less on how well they are managed. And that's where the situation begins to enter a different phase, one where even small changes can have disproportionate effects, and where stability becomes harder to maintain, not because of one major failure, but because of many smaller pressures acting at the same time. Up to now, everything has been building toward one question: what actually happens when the system is pushed far enough? Not in theory, in practice, because systems don't fail all at once. They degrade, and that degradation follows a pattern. First, performance becomes inconsistent. Not everywhere, not all the time, but in specific areas. Response times begin to vary. Some regions receive faster support, others slower. Information flow becomes uneven. At this stage, the system is still functioning, but it's no longer operating at full efficiency. Then comes the second phase. Gaps. Small at first. A delayed update. A missed coordination window. A resource arriving later than expected. Individually, these gaps don't seem critical, but they begin to create friction, and friction slows everything down. Now, layer those gaps across multiple regions, multiple events, multiple timelines, and suddenly, coordination becomes harder to maintain, because everything is slightly out of sync. This is where the third phase begins. Prioritization under pressure. Not planned prioritization. Reactive prioritization. Decisions made quickly based on incomplete or evolving information. Which areas receive immediate support? Which areas can wait? Which risks are considered more urgent? And this is where the system starts to reveal its limits. Because every decision to prioritize one area means another area receives less attention. Not intentionally, but inevitably. Now consider how this plays out across the current situation. Tornado outbreaks demand rapid response. They are fast, unpredictable, and highly destructive. Blizzard conditions disrupt transportation and supply chains. They slow movement, limit access, and isolate regions. Fire weather conditions require constant monitoring and rapid containment. Once a fire spreads, control becomes exponentially more difficult. Flooding introduces immediate life-threatening conditions. Water rises quickly, leaving little time to react. And Typhoon Sinlaku continues to intensify over the Pacific, a slower-moving but potentially more sustained and destructive system. Each of these events operates on a different timeline, different speed, different scale, different type of response, and yet they all draw from the same system. This is where synchronization becomes a problem, not because everything is happening at the exact same moment, but because everything is overlapping, enough to create continuous demand. There is no clear break, no recovery window, no moment where the system can reset and regain full capacity. Everything flows into the next, and when that happens, the system remains in a constant state of high load. Now introduce another factor: public awareness. Information doesn't just flow within emergency systems. It flows to the public, through media, through alerts, through communication channels. And when multiple events occur at once, attention becomes fragmented. People focus on what is closest to them, what affects them directly, which means some events receive less visibility, less coverage, less urgency in public perception. This doesn't change the actual risk, but it changes how that risk is perceived. And perception influences response. If an event is under-recognized, preparation may be reduced. If communication is inconsistent, people may not fully understand the severity. Now bring this back to Guam, a remote location, not part of the continental mainland. already less visible in broader media coverage, facing a potentially major storm. At the same time, other high-impact events are unfolding elsewhere. This creates a visibility imbalance, not intentional, but structural, and that matters because attention influences resource flow. It influences urgency. It influences how quickly support is mobilized. Now consider the timeline again. As Sinlaku continues to approach, conditions on the island will begin to change. Winds will increase. Rainfall will intensify. Infrastructure will start to come under stress. At a certain point, external support becomes harder to deliver. Flights are grounded. Ports are closed. The window for assistance narrows. And once that window closes, the situation becomes self-contained, meaning the island must rely on what is already in place. Preparedness becomes the deciding factor. Shelters, supplies, local response capacity, and under normal conditions, those systems are designed to handle severe weather. But again, these are not isolated conditions, because the broader system that would normally provide reinforcement is still engaged elsewhere, still under load, still managing multiple demands. This is where timing becomes critical again, because if support is not fully in place before conditions deteriorate, it becomes significantly harder to provide it later. Now think about how all of this interacts. A system under strain, multiple overlapping events, fragmented attention, limited windows for action, and a slow-moving storm that continues to evolve. None of these factors alone guarantees a negative outcome, but together, they increase the level of uncertainty. And uncertainty changes how situations develop, because it reduces predictability. And when predictability drops, control becomes harder to maintain. This is where the situation enters a phase where outcomes are no longer determined solely by planning, but by how events unfold in real time, how quickly conditions change, how effectively responses adapt, how well systems hold under pressure. And at this stage, even well-prepared systems can face challenges, not because they are weak, but because they are operating near their limits. And when systems operate near their limits for extended periods, they become more sensitive to disruption, which means the next phase doesn't depend on a single major event. It depends on whether additional stress is introduced, because at this point, even a small increase in pressure can have a much larger impact than expected. At this stage, everything depends on how the next phase unfolds, because once a system is operating near its limits, the impact of new stress is no longer proportional. It becomes amplified. What would normally be a manageable complication can turn into a significant disruption, and that's where escalation begins, not as a sudden event, but as a shift in how the system reacts to pressure. Now consider what escalation actually looks like in this context. It's not just a storm getting stronger. It's multiple variables changing at once. A storm intensifies slightly more than expected. Another event lasts longer than forecast. A response is delayed by a small margin. Individually, these are minor deviations. But in a system already under strain, they don't stay isolated. They interact. And when they interact, they create new conditions. This is how complexity increases, not by adding entirely new problems, but by changing how existing problems behave. Now bring this back to Typhoon Sinlaku. As it continues to move toward Guam, every small change in intensity or track matters. A slight shift in direction changes which areas receive the strongest impact. A small increase in wind speed can push infrastructure beyond its tolerance. A longer duration over warm water can lead to further intensification. Each of these changes affects planning. Evacuation zones may need adjustment. Shelter capacity may be tested. Resource positioning may need to shift. And all of this is happening while attention is still divided across multiple regions. Now consider the timing. As the storm approaches, the window for preparation narrows. There is a point where planning transitions into response, where movement becomes restricted, where decisions must be executed rather than reconsidered. And once that point is reached, flexibility drops sharply. You can no longer adjust easily. You can only respond to what is happening. This is where escalation becomes most critical. Because once flexibility is reduced, the system must rely on what has already been put in place. If preparations are strong, the system can absorb the impact. If there are gaps, those gaps become more visible. Now layer in the ongoing events across other regions. Response teams remain engaged. Resources remain allocated. Communication channels remain active. Nothing has been resolved. Everything is still in progress, which means the system cannot fully redirect its attention. It can only redistribute what remains. And redistribution under pressure is never perfect. Some areas receive more, some receive less, and those differences influence outcomes. Now think about how this affects coordination during peak conditions. As Sinlaku reaches closer to Guam, real-time information becomes critical. Wind speeds, rainfall rates, storm track updates, damage reports. All of this needs to flow quickly and accurately. But as you've already seen, even slight degradation in communication systems can introduce delays. Even minor uncertainty in data can affect decisions. And when decisions are made under time pressure, even small uncertainties matter. Now consider the human response on the ground. People preparing their homes, securing supplies, moving to shelters, trying to make the best decisions with the information they have. At a certain point, individual preparation reaches its limit. After that, outcomes depend on external factors, infrastructure holding or failing, emergency services responding effectively, conditions evolving as expected or not. This is where the situation becomes less controllable, not because no one is responding, but because the number of variables exceeds the ability to manage them perfectly. And that's where escalation becomes unpredictable, because unpredictability doesn't come from chaos. It comes from complexity. Too many interacting factors, too many moving parts, too many dependencies. Now step back again. What you're looking at is not just a set of events. It's a system under load, entering a phase where small changes can produce larger effects. A slight increase in storm intensity could lead to greater infrastructure damage. Greater damage could require more resources. More resources may not be immediately available. Delays could extend response times. Extended response times could increase overall impact. This is how escalation builds, not in one step, but in a sequence, each step influencing the next. Now consider the possibility that conditions remain stable, that nothing escalates beyond expectations, that each event behaves within forecast ranges. Even in that scenario, the system remains under sustained pressure, and sustained pressure alone can lead to gradual degradation, slower recovery, reduced efficiency, lingering impacts. But if conditions do escalate, if even one variable shifts beyond expectations, then the effects can move through the system more quickly, because there is less capacity to absorb them. This is why the current situation is significant, not because it guarantees a worst-case outcome, but because it reduces the margin for handling one. And when margins are reduced, the importance of every decision increases. Every adjustment, every response, every piece of information, everything matters more, because there is less room for error. Now the situation is approaching its most critical phase, the point where preparation transitions fully into impact, where systems are tested not just by pressure, but by performance under that pressure. And what happens next depends on how well those systems hold, not just individually, but collectively. Because in a compounding scenario, no event exists in isolation, And no outcome is determined by a single factor. Everything is connected. Everything is influenced by everything else. And that's what makes the next phase the most important one. Now the situation reaches its most critical point, not because everything has failed, but because everything is now being tested at the same time. This is the phase where preparation meets reality, where forecasts turn into actual conditions, where systems move from planning to performance. For Guam, this is when Typhoon Sinlaku begins to fully impact the island. Winds increase to sustained, damaging levels. Rainfall intensifies, accumulating faster than the ground and drainage systems can handle. Power infrastructure comes under stress. Communication networks begin to experience interruptions. At first, these impacts are partial. Some areas lose power, others maintain it. Some communication channels remain stable, others degrade. This uneven impact creates complexity, because response efforts must now operate in an environment where conditions are not consistent. Some areas are accessible, others are not. Some information is clear, other information is delayed or incomplete. Now consider how this affects decision-making in real time. Emergency teams rely on accurate situational awareness. Which areas are most affected? Where resources are needed most? Which routes remain open? But when communication becomes inconsistent, that awareness is harder to maintain. Decisions must be made with less certainty, and that increases risk. Now layer in the ongoing strain on the broader system. Other regions are still dealing with their own active events. Resources are still distributed. Attention is still divided, which means reinforcement is not immediate, not as fast as it would be under isolated conditions. This is where the effects of compounding pressure become visible, not as a single failure, but as a series of limitations. Response is slower than ideal. Coverage is not as complete. Coordination is more difficult. And all of this happens while conditions on the ground are intensifying. Now think about the progression of the storm itself. As Sinlaku moves across the island, the impact evolves. The leading edge brings initial wind and rain. Then comes the core, the strongest winds, the heaviest rainfall, the highest stress on infrastructure. This is the period where systems are pushed hardest, where failures are most likely to occur. Power grids can go down across large areas. Communication networks can become significantly disrupted. Transportation routes can become blocked. And once those systems are affected, recovery during the event becomes extremely difficult. Now consider the timing again. During peak conditions, external support is at its most limited. Flights are grounded. Ports are closed. Conditions prevent movement, which means the island is effectively isolated. Everything depends on internal capacity, local response teams, pre-positioned supplies, prepared infrastructure. If those systems hold, the impact can be managed. If they are overwhelmed, the situation becomes more severe. Now connect this to the earlier phases. All the pressure building across the system, all the resource distribution, all the coordination challenges. This is where it all converges. Because the effectiveness of response during this phase depends on everything that happened before it. Preparation, allocation, timing, communication. Every decision made earlier now influences what is possible in this moment. And this is where compounding effects are most visible. Because limitations don't appear suddenly. They reveal themselves under stress. A delayed resource earlier now means less support available now. A communication issue earlier now means less clarity now. A prioritization decision earlier now affects which areas receive attention now. Everything connects. Now expand the view again. While Guam is experiencing peak impact, other regions are still active. Storms in the plains may still be developing. Flooding may still be ongoing. Fire conditions may still be present. Blizzard effects may still be limiting transportation. The system is not resetting. It is continuing, which means recovery efforts cannot begin at full scale immediately, because resources are still engaged, still distributed, still managing multiple demands. This extends the duration of impact, not necessarily the storm itself, but the recovery process. Power restoration may take longer. Supply delivery may be delayed. Infrastructure repair may be slower. And the longer recovery takes, the more the overall impact increases. This is another form of compounding, not just during the event, but after it. Now consider the psychological aspect. For people experiencing the event, uncertainty increases stress. Limited communication, unclear timelines, incomplete information. All of this affects how people respond and how communities recover. Because recovery is not just physical, it's also informational. People need to know what is happening, what to expect, what to do next. When that information is limited or delayed, recovery becomes more difficult. Now step back one more time. What you're seeing in this phase is not just a storm making landfall. It's the intersection of multiple pressures reaching their peak at the same time. Environmental, operational, systemic, human, all interacting, all influencing outcomes. And this is where the true impact of a compounding scenario becomes clear. Not because any single event is unprecedented, but because of how they align, how they overlap, how they stretch the system, and how they reduce the margin for handling unexpected changes. At this point, the outcome is no longer determined solely by forecasts. It's determined by performance under pressure, how well systems hold, how effectively responses adapt, how quickly recovery can begin. And that leads to the final phase. Because once the peak has passed, the next question is not what happened, it's what remains, and how systems recover after being pushed to their limits. Eventually, the peak passes. Winds begin to slow. Rainfall decreases. The most intense phase of the storm moves away. At first, it might feel like the danger is over. But this is where the final phase begins. Because the end of impact is not the end of the event. It's the beginning of recovery. And recovery, in a compounding scenario, is not immediate. It's uneven. Some areas regain stability quickly. Others take longer. Power may return in one region while another remains offline. Communication networks may restore partially, but not fully. Transportation routes may open in stages, not all at once. This uneven recovery creates a new kind of complexity, because the system is no longer dealing with a single active threat. It's dealing with the aftermath of multiple ones. At the same time, now consider what recovery actually requires. Assessment. Teams need to understand the extent of damage. Which areas are most affected? What infrastructure has failed? That information is not always available immediately, especially when communication has been disrupted. So assessment takes time. Then comes response. Clearing roads, restoring power, delivering supplies, providing medical assistance. Each of these actions depends on coordination, and coordination depends on systems that may still be partially degraded. Now layer in the broader context. Other regions are also recovering from flooding, from storms, from fire conditions, from snow-related disruptions, which means resources are not fully available. They are still distributed, still engaged, still limited. This slows recovery, not because response is absent, but because it is stretched. Now consider the timeline. Recovery is not a single moment. It's a process, days, sometimes weeks. And during that time, additional challenges can appear. Secondary effects. Floodwaters receding can reveal structural damage. Power outages can affect access to essential services. Supply disruptions can create shortages. These are not new disasters, but they are consequences. and they extend the overall impact. Now think about how systems reset. After a major event, systems need time to rebuild capacity, to replenish resources, to rest personnel, to repair infrastructure. But in a compounding scenario, that reset period is reduced because new demands may already be emerging. Other events may still be active. New conditions may be developing, which means the system does not fully return to baseline. It remains partially engaged, partially strained, and that affects readiness for future events. This is where the concept of a new normal becomes relevant, not as a dramatic statement, but as an operational reality. If multiple moderate to severe events begin to occur more frequently at the same time, then systems are required to operate under sustained load more often, which changes how they must be designed, how resources are allocated, how responses are planned, because the assumption of isolated events becomes less reliable. Now step back and look at the entire sequence. A storm forming in the Pacific. Multiple extreme events developing across different regions. Large-scale atmospheric patterns supporting all of them simultaneously. Resources becoming distributed. Systems operating under increasing load. Subtle degradations in performance. Escalation as conditions intensify. Peak impact testing the limits of response. And then a recovery phase that is slower and more complex because of everything happening at once. This is not a single story. It's a system-level event, one that reveals how interconnected everything is. Not directly, but through shared dependencies, shared resources, shared limitations. And that's the key takeaway. The risk is not just in individual disasters. It's in how they align, how they overlap, how they interact, because when they do, they don't just add up, they multiply. Now, does this mean every situation will lead to failure? No. Systems are resilient. They are designed to handle stress. They adapt. They improve. But resilience depends on margins, on having enough capacity to absorb unexpected changes. And when those margins are reduced, the importance of every variable increases. Every decision, every response, every piece of information, everything matters more because there is less room for error. What you've seen is an example of how complex systems behave under pressure, not collapsing instantly, but becoming more sensitive, more difficult to manage, more dependent on how events unfold in real time. And as patterns like this continue to appear, the question becomes less about whether events will happen, and more about how systems will adapt to handle them. Because in a world where multiple risks can align at the same time, preparedness is no longer just about individual events. It's about understanding the system as a whole, and how it behaves when everything happens at once. Now here's the real question. If this is becoming more common, are we actually prepared for it? Because this isn't just about one storm or one place. It's about how systems behave when everything starts happening at once. If you found this breakdown useful, leave a like, subscribe for more deep dives like this, and tell me what you think about this in the comments.